Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Ideas on Fire webinar on podcasting as public intellectualism. My name is Dr. Cathy Hannabach. I'm the founder and president of Ideas on Fire, which is an academic editing and consulting agency, and we work specifically with progressive interdisciplinary academics on helping them write and publish amazing texts, enliven public conversations, and ultimately create more just worlds. So that middle part, enliven public conversations, is what I'm going to be talking about today with regards to podcasting as public intellectualism. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we jump into this topic. If you notice on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat room with three little chat boxes in there. If at any time during the webinar itself, you want to talk through some of the ideas, you have a question, you want to get some feedback from the other participants, you can post in the chat room on the right-hand side of your screen. If at any point during the webinar you have a question for me that you want to make sure that I get to in the Q&A at the end, you can either put it in the chat room over there, or if you notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Ask a Question tab. If you click on that, you'll see a little pop-up window with a big orange button that'll let you ask a question or suggest a topic. So you can either put your questions in the chat room, or you can use that orange button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question, and I'll make sure to get to it in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and hopefully this will work the way that it should. There we go. Okay. So just a little bit of, oh wait, that's enter full screen. There we go. Okay. Just a little bit of background of how I got into this topic. I am the host of a podcast called Imagine Otherwise, which I think some of you have listened to or have been guests on, which I'm very grateful for. And I got into podcasting about 2 years ago. So Imagine Otherwise is coming up on our 2-year anniversary. It launched in January of 2015, and it has grown enormously. And it's been really, really fun to see that process and to be part of that process. So Imagine Otherwise is a podcast that highlights people and projects who bridge art, activism, and academia in the service of social justice. So I get the opportunity to talk with a lot of filmmakers, performance artists, choreographers, scholars, journalists. It kind of runs the gamut of careers and of creative fields who are all interested in the intersections of art, activism, and academia. So a lot of the examples that I'll be using today to kind of illustrate some of the concepts that I'll be talking about come from my work on Imagine Otherwise. I'm also happy to talk in the Q&A afterwards, in the discussion afterwards, about more examples if folks are interested. Okay. So what's on tap today? I want to talk about why podcasting and why public intellectualism, because these are two terms, podcasting and public intellectualism. They get thrown around quite a bit, particularly these days. They're kind of hot buzzwords, but I want to talk about why it's interesting when they come together. I'm also going to talk about creating a podcast. Some of you are already podcast creators yourself, and some of you are curious about it. Some of you, it might not have ever entered your mind to start a podcast, but I'm going to go through some of the process of creating a podcast, figuring out what your idea is, figuring out who your audience is, figuring out the kind of time and financial budgets that you have to create a podcast, and then figure out how to position it to reach the audience that you want to reach. I'm also going to talk about teaching with podcasts, something that's seen a kind of exciting growth over the last few years. I'm also going to provide a sample podcasting workflow, so you just get a sense of how a single episode itself actually gets made. And then finally, I'm going to give you some resources for tools that you might use to create your own podcast. This slide deck I'll put the link to it in the chat room at the end of the webinar. And those of you who are registered for the webinar, in about an hour after the webinar ends, you should get an email with a link to the video replay as well as the slide deck. So don't feel the need to scribble to write everything down. You can look at it later. Okay, so why podcasting? and why public intellectualism. So podcasting at its most basic is a form of internet-based radio. It's a primarily auditory form. It's about sound. But I want us to remember today and in our discussion today that it's not just an audio form. Yes, it heavily features sound, and we'll talk a little bit about what that does. But because of how podcasting gets distributed, largely through the internet, it also comes with other media forms that make podcasting itself a kind of multimedia genre. So as an audio form, as a sound-based medium that is also multimedia, right? I want us to think about what sound can do, right? What can sound do that other forms of media or other genres can't? So what does sound in the context of podcasting allow us to get at in terms of questions, in terms of themes, in terms of conversations, in terms of communities? One of the reasons why podcasting has become so popular lately is its accessibility, right? So unlike some other forms of scholarship, unlike some other forms of public discussion, podcasts have an accessibility issue that make them really intriguing to a whole host of communities for a whole host of different reasons, right? Think about how, for instance, those of you who already consume podcasts, who are avid podcast fans, think of how you access a podcast. Where do you get it? Where do you listen to it? And how do you engage with it to access it? Now think about how that contrasts with how you engage with and where you engage with, say, a scholarly journal article, right? The point here is one isn't better than the other, and I'm going to keep coming back to this point throughout the session today. But the two different mediums allow for different types of access. It's not necessarily different amounts, but different types. Where and how people can engage with the thing is different for podcasting in the same way it's different for journal articles, different for academic books, different for journalism pieces, different for television shows and films, right? All of these different mediums allow or disallow certain types of questions or topics. In the field of media studies, film studies, cultural studies, this is what's known as medium specificity, right? Certain genres, certain mediums allow and disallow certain questions and topics. There are certain themes that a live dance performance can explore that a painting cannot. There are certain questions that a long-form investigative journalism article can get at, can find answers to, that a television show just cannot, right? So the point isn't that one of these is somehow better than the other. It's that the form itself structures what can be said within it, right? So we can think about podcasting as a medium like any other medium, alongside journal articles, alongside television shows, alongside traditional radio, right? As a medium that has a certain degree of specificity that allows and enables certain kinds of questions and themes to be developed. So why might you podcast? If you are intrigued at the kind of accessibility issue, at the ability to share your academic research with a different or a broader audience, why might you podcast? The first one that I want to emphasize, because I think it gets perhaps overlooked, is it's fun. Podcasting is really fun. It allows you to use and develop a huge amount of creativity and experimentation in a way that traditional academic scholarship doesn't, right? And there are good and bad reasons for that. Traditional academic scholarship in the form of journal articles and books published by scholarly presses are designed to reach a specific audience. And in general, they do that very, very well. They also are designed to allow you to explore certain questions, right, that require a very kind of intense and focused amount of research that usually takes place over a large period of time, which is one of the reasons why scholarly publishing takes so long, right? Podcasting, as yet another kind of outlet, another medium, allows you to get more creative and experiment with stuff in a way that some other forms don't. So you get to learn a lot when you're podcasting. You get to learn about tools. You get to learn about software. You get to learn about narrative structure. You get to learn about interviewing if you're doing interviews. You get to learn about audio editing. That was a kind of new thing for me when I first got into podcasting, was I got to learn how to edit audio, which I had never done before. And now it's really fun and pretty easy for me. Podcasting also lets you get clear on the stakes of scholarly work. One of the big kind of questions that anyone who's ever written scholarship has been asked, either by their publisher, by their editor, maybe by their mom, by somebody who's engaging with their work in some capacity, that scary question of, so what? What's the big point of your work? What are the stakes? What are the political, economic, and cultural stakes of your work, right? And answering that question is vital to any publishing form, right? Because it's why audiences should care about the thing that you care about. Podcasting is a great way for you to get super clear on the stakes of your scholarly work. This is assuming you're podcasting for the purposes of sharing your scholarly work or somebody else's scholarly work, right? The medium itself forces you, because of length requirements and because of audience requirements, it forces you to get super duper clear about why your thing matters. Not matters to you, but matters to the world and the universe more broadly, right? Podcasting is also a really great way to remember and to foreground the fact that we have and we are bodies. Oftentimes with printed work, bodies tend to disappear, right? Bodies aren't part of the page in a direct way, at least. Podcasting, to go back to that point I was making earlier about sound, podcasting emphasizes voice. Without voice, there is no podcasting, right? Even if you're using recorded music or recorded sound in some capacity, there are voices in that, right? For podcasts like mine, for example, that highlight scholars, I do interviews with scholars, artists, choreographers, etc. One of the things that audiences really like about the podcast itself is hearing their real voices. Right? These are people that folks have encountered largely through the written word and largely love through the written word. But it gives audiences a chance to hear people's voices and remember that those people have bodies. Podcasting is also a great opportunity to make something, which can be really exciting for fields that are largely based in critique, right? Scholarly critique is the bedrock of intellectual work, and it's fantastic, right? Forming a critical relationship to the world in which we live is our jobs as intellectuals of any sort, right? But making something, actually producing the thing that you're writing about, producing the thing that you're researching, building something, creating something, rather than just analyzing something, lets you use parts of your brain that you don't in other capacity. Oftentimes this is called arts-based research, where you make the thing that you're studying, you build the thing that you're researching. And it can be a great way to learn kind of the behind the scenes or the production process of something that you're interested in researching. For example, let's say your scholarly field or your research focuses on social justice movements and their relationship to publishing. Say, maybe you make a podcast interviewing social justice activists, or maybe you make a podcast where you share little bits of your research across different episodes in relationship to that topic, right? So it's a way of looking at your research from new angles and seeing new things that can be made out of it. Podcasting is also a deeply social activity. Now, hear me out, even those of you who are introverts and this doesn't sound particularly appealing to you. I am as well, but I love podcasting for its sociality, and here's why. Podcasting communities are vibrant and generally incredibly supportive. Because it's a fairly new medium, not new in the sense of the medium itself was invented super recently. It has a good decade and a half long history. But in terms of popularity and in terms of how many people are involved in making these things, right, it's still fairly new. Which means that the communities organized around it, the communities of people making podcasts, generally are super supportive. You learn a whole lot, you get to meet really interesting people that you wouldn't necessarily meet otherwise, and you get to collaborate with them on various projects. And this is a bonus, one that you might not have thought of immediately for a sound-based medium. Podcasting also has the potential to make you a better writer. How on earth would this happen? Because podcasting requires you to be very clear about your audience, to figure out how to talk to that audience in a way that makes sense to that audience. It forces you to learn how to edit the words and the text that you use. It teaches you about things like graphic design, if you're making your logos or judging logos that other people make for you. And it also teaches you about editing, right? It obviously can teach you about audio editing, how to cut sounds in relationship to each other. But that structure of figuring out what is the most important piece of audio here, what order do these questions need to come in so that they make a narrative structure across the whole piece? Can I cut out this and will the overarching arc still make sense? Those questions that you're dealing with regards to sound when you're editing your episodes are the same questions that you deal with when you're editing your written work. So if you let it, podcasting can actually make you a better writer. It forces you to be more succinct. It forces you to be more direct. It pushes you to be more bold and confident and stop hiding behind some of the writing tricks that academics tend to fall back on, things like passive voice, things like burying your point underneath everyone else's thoughts on a topic. Because podcasting as an auditory form, as a fairly short auditory form comparatively, right, compared to, let's say, a scholarly book, it forces you to wade through and get rid of that stuff. So your point is clear, it's bam, right up front, it's succinct, it's confident, and it's bold. And it fits the specific audience that you want to reach. Those are things that written work strives for as well. So podcasting can make you a better writer. So let's say you're intrigued by this. Let's say you're curious about creating podcasts yourself. The first thing I'd encourage you to think about is audience and how that fits idea. So start with people first, rather than the idea. As academics, we're trained to go immediately for the idea, right? Like what topic, what theme, what issue, what historical period, what text, what concept are you super excited about? Put that on hold for a moment, because that is important and we will get to that. But start with people first. Who do you want to create this thing for? Get really specific here. Maybe you want to create a podcast for first year undergraduates, for students. Maybe you want to create a podcast for artists. Maybe you want to create a podcast for software designers in your city. Whatever it might be, get specific about who you're making this thing for before you start to hone in on what the thing actually is. So that audience that you've decided on, what's going on in their lives? Where do they hang out? How do they spend their days? Who are they around? Figuring this stuff out lets you know when, where, and why they'd listen to your podcast. If the audience that you want to create a podcast for spends a lot of time commuting, that tells you something about where and how they might listen to your podcast. They might listen to your podcast on trains. They might listen to your podcast on buses or in their cars or on their headphones if they're biking, right? Where do they hang out? Where physically, what environments are they in? All of these things tell you how your specific audience might engage with the thing that you're making for them. What's your relationship to that audience? Are you a member of that audience, or are you making a podcast for a group of people that you're not a member of? Neither one of these is better than the other. It's perfectly fine to create a podcast for people who are different from you. It's also fine to create a podcast for people who are like you, right? But because those are two different relationships, either you're making a podcast for people, for a group that you are a part of, versus you're making a podcast for a group that you are not a part of, that should shape how you approach the topics that you might turn into your podcast. So once you've gotten super clear on your audience, you have a really good sense of how they spend their lives, how they spend their days, right? What their daily routines are. You've also clarified your relationship to them. Now you can start thinking about what topics are they interested in, what topics are you interested in, and what is the overlap, right? Everything that they're interested in, you might not be interested in. And everything that you find intriguing is not necessarily intriguing for that audience. The point here is to find that overlap. Because remember, you're making this podcast. You're going to be spending a lot of time on it. You're going to be spending a lot of brain power on it. It's going to take up a portion of your life. So it should be a topic that you don't hate. Because otherwise, why on earth would you do that? Even if you're getting paid to make a podcast for somebody else, I would hope that the theme wasn't something that you absolutely hated or found completely boring and useless in the world, right? So where is that overlap between the things that your audience are interested in and the things that you're interested in? That overlap, that sweet spot, that's your topic, or several topics. Maybe you have a couple to choose from. So let's say you've gotten super clear on your audience. You've created a few topics and you've chosen one of them for your podcast. Now you can start thinking about budget. If you notice, we're still not to form yet. I'm going to get there in a minute. So you can start to think about how much time and how much money do you have to dedicate to your podcast. I'll talk about money in a minute because I know it's something that people have a lot of questions about, but let's start with time. How many hours do you have to dedicate to this thing? How many hours do you have each week, each month, or each semester? Be realistic here. If you are teaching a 4-4 course load and you are president of a scholarly association and you have a zillion mentees and you have a super busy personal life, a weekly show probably isn't going to be a great idea for you. On the other hand, maybe you're on sabbatical, or maybe you have a reduced teaching load this semester. Or maybe you can carve out hours, you can kind of trade off tasks in a specific period of time, right? So figure out how many hours you have to dedicate on a regular basis to creating this podcast. You can also think about whether you want to work consistently or you want to batch the work. So in those two examples I gave, for instance, the first person who's super busy, who's doing a million things, who is not currently on sabbatical, that person might have a little bit of time each week to dedicate to creating a podcast. On the other hand, the person that's maybe on sabbatical this semester to do research on a particular project, they might create a lot of episodes during that semester and then release them over the course of the next year, rather than spending X hours every week over the course of the year. Right? So this is going to depend on your situation and on your schedule. A lot of times folks create episodes in batches. We do this to a certain degree. There are certain seasons where we have more time to dedicate to creating episodes. And so we'll just create a ton of them and then release them. Our podcast comes out every 2 weeks. And so we release those over the course of the following months. Just to give you a kind of baseline or a sense of how we do this at Imagine Otherwise. This is not necessarily how you need to do it, but just to give you an example, because people often want examples when I talk to them about this. So Imagine Otherwise episodes are about 20 to 30 minutes long. There are a few that are a bit longer than that. There are a few that are a bit shorter than that, but most of them fall in that 20 to 30 minute range. Each episode of the Imagine Otherwise podcast takes us about 9 hours to produce. And that includes everything. That includes brainstorming guests. That includes sending guest invitations. Do you want to come on the podcast? It includes scheduling those interviews as well as doing those interviews. It includes writing, rewriting, and rewriting interview questions. It includes audio editing. It includes creating all of the promotional materials because we make images for social media sharing for each episode. It includes writing the show notes, copy editing the show notes, scheduling out all of our social media posts about each episode, uploading all that stuff to the server, creating metadata for that, all of that kind of stuff. And that is spread out by now, it's spread out over 4 Ideas on Fire team members. When I first started the podcast, it was just me. So I was doing all of the jobs. Over about the last year, I've been able to bring other people, other Ideas on Fire folks into the podcast production process, which has been enormously helpful. But just to give you a sense of how we spread that out across our team and around how long we spend on each episode. So once you've figured out how much time you have to dedicate to this thing, you can also start to think about how much money you have to dedicate to this thing. Podcasts do not have to be expensive. Anyone who ever tells you they're full of crap. They do not have to be expensive, but there are costs associated with them. And it's important to keep that in mind when you're deciding whether you want to start one and how you would actually go about doing that. So how much money do you have to dedicate to your podcast? When you're thinking about this, you can think about the difference between upfront costs. These are kind of one-time costs, the thing that you're going to spend upfront when you're starting your podcast, but they are largely non-repetitive costs. So you just pay once and then you're done. So things like microphones or equipment or one-time software fees. But there are also recurring costs. So these are costs that happen repetitively. They might happen every month, they might happen every quarter, they might happen every year, but these are ongoing costs, right? These include things like labor, right? If you're paying anybody to be involved in any part of your podcast, they cost money, as they should. And so those labor costs are something you need to calculate into your budget for your podcast. Hosting costs. Hosting costs are pretty low in general. They're usually charged annually, but podcasts need to be hosted on a dedicated server. Technically, you can host your podcast on your website, but you should not do that because podcast files as audio files are huge. And if you have more than a few episodes, perhaps you want many more than a few episodes, you can't host it on your own website. You just don't have the server space. So podcast hosts, Libsyn is probably the best known one. That's what we use. These are dedicated servers that have huge amounts of space that can handle hosting all of your podcast episodes. Recurring costs might also include your website. You might also choose to create transcripts or show notes for your episodes. You could pay people to do that directly. You can do those yourself. There are different systems for that, different options for that, but that is something to consider with regards to cost. Social media. If you are using any kind of social media scheduling tool that costs money, or you're paying someone to schedule out your social media, things like that should be taken into account with regards to costs. And then any kind of software as a service. So these are unlike one-time software fees. More and more these days, we're seeing software move to a software as a service model, and these are recurring costs for access to software. So this would be like your monthly cost or your annual cost for a particular piece of software. Now, when I talk about podcasts with anybody, a lot of folks want to know if there's any way that you can make money podcasting. And monetization is something that podcasting communities are talking quite a lot about. There's been significant shifts in this over the last 5 years. Even within the last 1 year, we've seen some pretty radical shifts on this topic. But in general, the short answer to will you make any money on your podcast, the short answer is no. You will not make any money from your podcast. So there better be another reason that you're doing it. Even the giant podcasting agencies, the giant podcasting networks, some of which produce amazing, amazing work, they're still not making very much money on that. And if you're just starting out, you're definitely not going to make any money on it. At Ideas on Fire, we don't make any money on the Imagine Otherwise podcast. It's purely an expense. But it's also super fun and it's completely worth it for us. So short answer, no, you're not going to make any money podcasting. So there better be another reason that you're doing it. So once you've figured out your audience, once you've figured out your idea, and once you've figured out your budget, then you can start to think about the structure, the type, or the genre of a show that fits that audience, that idea, and that budget. So here I put several different genres of podcasts. These aren't all of the genres. These are perhaps the most well-known. Most podcasts can fall into these categories. There are a few weird exceptions, but they're exceptions. So one genre of podcasts that you might be familiar with are interview shows. So this is where a single host or several hosts interview a single guest or several guests. Imagine Otherwise, our podcast, is an example of an interview show. So I host that show, and in each episode, I interview a different guest. Right? Ben Franklin's World, which is a fantastic history podcast produced by Liz Covert, is another example of an interview show. So she hosts it and she interviews a different guest for each episode. There's some specific pros for interview-based shows. For instance, the guests can help market the episode, which can be really helpful. They tell their networks, they tell their communities about their episode, which brings in other audiences that you might not personally have access to. Guests, by definition, because guests are different from each other, it's not just you. These types of shows can lend themselves to topic diversity, so you get a wider range of topics that you can talk about than if it were just you. And the interview-based shows have a kind of medium range cost. So they're not the most expensive ones and they're not the cheapest ones, but they're on the lower cost side of the spectrum. There are also a couple cons for interview shows. Scheduling is a pain in the ass. As any of you who have ever worked with anyone else on any type of project, scheduling can be a giant pain, especially if you're going after guests who are super busy or you're trying to coordinate a large number of people and schedules. So scheduling can be challenging and it takes a lot of time. So if you don't have a lot of time, an interview-based show might not be the best fit for you. Depending on your topic, you might have difficulties finding a supply of guests. If your topic is super duper duper niche, and there are like 5 people on the planet who are interested in this topic, you can totally make a podcast about that. But if you have an interview-based show, you're pretty much stuck with those 5 people as guests for every single episode. On the other hand, if you have a very large topic that appeals to a large number of people, you might not have this problem of running out of guests to feature. And topic diffusion can also be a challenge for interview-based shows. So interview-based shows, like any other show, are organized around a particular theme, right? And when you bring more guests, you bring more people into the content, your topic can sometimes get a little diffuse. Usually you can fix this with editing. You can fix this with how you narratively stitch together the episode. For example, if guests go off on like several weird tangents that might be super interesting, but don't in any way relate to the topic of your show, you can edit those out. You can make those guest segments. You can release those clips on your website as not part of the actual episode. There are ways you can get around this, but this can be an issue with certain kinds of interview-based shows. Another type of podcast show, another genre that you might be familiar with, are chat shows. This is the easiest way to get into podcasting. A chat show is a show in which a single or multiple hosts just talk. So it's just them, right? For example, the West Wing Weekly, which is one of my favorite podcasts, is a chat-based show. It's kind of a combination of a chat-based show and an interview show, actually. But it started out as a chat-based show where it's just two hosts talking to each other and to the audience, right? They're talking about the show The West Wing. It's kind of half recap, half fan, kind of fan engagement. It's super fun. But the point is there's two hosts, right? Two Dope Queens, fantastic example of a chat-based show, right? It's two people talking to each other about specific topics. Sometimes they bring on guests, but in general, they're the two people on the show. Pop Rocket is another example of a great chat-based show. Couple of pros about chat-based shows. As I said, this is the kind of genre that's the easiest to get into because it has the lowest time and costs. It's because you are the only person whose schedule you have to deal with, it doesn't take as long, right? You can just sit down and talk into a recorder, talk into a microphone, record yourself. That's the raw material for your episode. That can happen super fast. In contrast to having to schedule interviews, email back and forth, coordinate other people's schedules, make sure everyone can log on, make sure the recording sounds good, et cetera, et cetera. It's also much more consistent because you and your co-host are the only people on the show. So the episodes are more consistent with each other. There are cons, of course, that include if it's just you or just you and a co-host, that means it's just you and a co-host marketing it, right? There's also more pressure on hosts to be entertaining. For the hosts of Two Dope Queens, that is not a problem. They are super entertaining in and among themselves, right? But if you are not super outgoing or you are not super comfortable holding court in social situations, a chat show might not be the best format for you. There are also narrative shows, and these are the ones that have gotten the most press lately. So narrative shows are shows that tell a story. They can be either fiction or nonfiction. Some of the most popular examples of narrative shows include Serial, right? Hugely popular narrative podcast show. Welcome to Night Vale, another hugely hugely popular one. 99% Invisible, which is one of my favorites. The Illusionist, S-Town. If you've ever read a popular news article about podcasting, you've probably seen them talk about narrative shows, right? Narrative shows are incredibly great for producing immersive experiences. Because they layer sound, because they have kind of intense storytelling qualities, they can create really passionate fan bases. Serial is a great example of that, right? That show just exploded, right? In terms of fan bases, in terms of it got huge numbers of people into podcasting who had never heard of this thing before. And one of the reasons why, some of that has to do with marketing, some of that has to do with the topics that they were covering, some of that has to do with the host, some of that has to do with the production company, but a lot of it has to do with the genre itself, right? Because it's a storytelling genre, it's a narrative genre, that opens itself up onto a larger fan base. Narrative shows are also the most expensive type of shows. And that's because they take a huge amount of production time and post-production time. Exactly those things that make narrative shows most immersive, the layering of sound, the fact that there's music combined with found footage, combined with interviews, combined with the host talking, combined with background sound, combined with interviews that other people did that you're bringing the sound in and layering it. All of those things that create really immersive experiences take a huge amount of time. So if you don't have a lot of time, or you're just getting into, you want to like test out podcasting to see if you like it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you just kind of want a low stakes entry point, I don't recommend starting with a narrative show. On the other hand, if you've been podcasting for a while and you want to kind of up your game, narrative shows can be a really fun way to learn how to do some new stuff. I'm starting a new narrative project that I won't talk a lot about because it's still in the early stages, but that's kind of how I approach that. So my show, Imagine Otherwise, is an interview-based show. And now that I've done it for about 2 years, and I will continue to do it, I'm exploring some more kind of narrative storytelling in a mini series for it. Another genre you might be familiar with are news shows, and these are more kind of similar to news shows on television. So, for example, Up First, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is kind of a combo of quiz and news show. Embedded, a lot of news outlets, radio outlets, NPR does a lot of these, produce news shows. Pros, obviously topics are provided. You don't have to come up with topics because current events happen, right? You obviously have to come up with a theme of your show, and you have to track down those current events and create stories about those current events, but the events themselves are happening, right? You're never going to run out of ideas. On the other hand, though, keeping up with all of those current events and creating episodes about them can be kind of challenging. It also means you can't plan too far ahead. So if you notice for the other genres, you can pretty much you can make the episodes whenever you want. When you make them doesn't have an intrinsic relationship to their release date, right? So for instance, if you're making a whole bunch of episodes over the summer because you have some more free time, and then you're releasing them over the course of the entire year, which is a common structure for podcast production, you can't do that with news shows, obviously, right? Because all the news that happens doesn't happen in the summer. So you can't plan too far ahead. And then you also have the option to think about mini-series versus seasons versus continual production. Continual production is you create and you put out a show at a regular interval. That might be every week, might be every 2 weeks, it might be every month, whatever time period you've set, but it's continual, right? Another model for that is seasons. So you can think of these as kind of like television seasons, similar to television seasons. Serial is a really good example of this. So they have particular seasons, right? Season 1 was about this topic. Season 2 was about this topic. And those seasons are released at particular points in time, right? And then mini-series are a kind of way that you can stitch together several episodes that fit under an umbrella of a consistent theme. At Imagine Otherwise, we've done 2 mini-series so far. We did our signal boosting mini-series in March of this year, which was a collaboration with the Association for Asian American Studies. And we also did the ICAI mini-series in May. Was that released in May? That was released in May. The ICAI series, which was a collaboration we did with the Smithsonian about an upcoming art exhibit in Hawaii. And you can mix and match these, right? So if you, for instance, have a couple episodes that seem to cohere around a particular theme, you might consider officially making that a mini-series. On the other hand, mini-series can also be a good way to like figure out if you want to podcast. Maybe you make just 3 episodes. You're not sure if you really want a whole show yet. You're still testing this out to see if you like it, to see if it's feasible given your life and your time and that kind of stuff. Maybe make 3 episodes about something and you post them on a website somewhere. It can be a good entry point into it. Okay, I'm going to skip through this because we're running out, or we're closing in on time, and I want to make sure I get to teaching and to workflow. But just in general, one thing to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out how to, if you want to, and how to start your podcast, is to think about marketing. How are people going to find your thing, right? Where's your audience already hanging out? Can you go hang out there with them? Can you form connections with them such that they can then learn about this awesome podcast that you made for them, right? And one thing that people often forget is to balance their time and their budget between creating the thing and marketing the thing. Because marketing the thing is part of making the thing. It's not an addition. It's not something to tack on later. It's not something to worry about at the very end. How you're going to get this thing into the hands of people who want it should be at the forefront of all the decisions you're making about genre, about audience, about budget, about who's going to help you on this thing, about what the thing is actually going to be about. So integrating that into all of it will help your podcast out enormously. Okay. How about teaching with podcasts? So one of the things that I really like to talk with folks about is how they can incorporate podcasts into their classroom. So podcasts can be scholarship in this same way that films, that digital projects, that albums, that journal articles, and that books can be scholarship, right? And there are a couple different ways you can approach this in the classroom. So you can think about you can assign podcasts as course texts, and you can assign podcasts as course assignments. So the first, assigning podcasts as course texts. In this sense, you would assign them the same way that you'd assign scholarly articles or books or films. When deciding which podcasts, which episodes within a single podcast you want to assign, you're going to need to think about things like length, how long is the episode, how long is it going to take students to listen to it, and also the density of material. This is something you're already considering when you're trying to figure out which journal articles or books you're going to assign as well, right? You should also think about access. So where can the students get the podcast episode that you've assigned them? And then where can they listen to it, right? Also, something to keep in mind, what non-audio formats are available for students with diverse bodies? Podcasts are an audio-heavy format, right? So if you're assigning this format in a classroom, you need to make sure that you have full transcripts, written transcripts, available for any episodes that you assign, so that students who are deaf or students who are hard of hearing or students who learn better visually than they do auditorily can still participate in your class, right? Just like in the same way that you put written course materials or films on reserve at the library for students who can't afford to buy textbooks or can't access them, the same way that you make sure that any films that you assign have subtitles, right, for students with diverse bodies, the same way that you make all course materials available in multiple formats. I'm hoping you do all these things. You do all these things, right? If not, it's a good chance to start thinking about that. In the same way that you do that for any other medium, you need to make sure to do it with podcasts. You're also going to need to teach them how to take notes on episodes. For those of you who teach films, you're pretty familiar with this, right? You set aside time in class, or you should set aside time in class, to teach students how to take notes on the text that you're assigning them, right? Rather than assuming that they already know how to take notes on films or on scholarly books or on digital projects or websites or whatever it is that you're assigning them. So teach them how to take notes on episodes. You can also assign podcasts as assignments. So in the first example, students are consuming podcasts, right, about some topic that's relevant to your course. But you can also have students create podcasts as an assignment, as a creative assignment. And here it's super important to explain why. Just the same way that you explain, hopefully, why students are writing analytical essays, or why students are creating blog posts, or why students are doing group presentations, you would also explain why you're assigning podcasts. What about this medium matters, right? Versus it's just a cool new thing I heard about. There should be some direct connection to what you want students to learn in the class that explains why you're choosing this medium of assignment. Right? You're also going to have to teach them how to make the podcasts themselves. You might already know, like you might already produce a podcast yourself, in which great, this is a great opportunity to teach them how to come up with a theme, how to brainstorm interviewees, how to write interview questions that are productive versus non-productive, how to actually interview, how to edit audio. Maybe you don't already know these things. Maybe you don't already have a podcast. You can still assign podcasts as assignments. And this is, if so, you get to learn how to do all that stuff before your students. And then you get to learn how to teach your students that stuff. So it can be actually a really good excuse. Like if you're like, I want to learn something about audio editing, but I just can't seem to find the time outside of work to do it. Maybe you set a goal to have a podcast assignment for next semester, in which case you are forced to learn audio editing so that you can teach your students next semester how it works. Okay. I put in here a sample workflow. This is just so you can kind of see how episodes actually get put together. This is not the only way to do this. This is just the way we do it at Imagine Otherwise. So we start out with development. So as I said, Imagine Otherwise is an interview-based show, and it has a theme that's pretty specific, but that also has a lot of leeway within it. So we're looking for projects and people who bridge art, activism, and academia, right? So 3 key areas. So when we're in the development phase, we're identifying and researching potential guests, right? We're also planning out the episodes. What's the order that would make the most sense? Are there episodes that need to be bunched together for a particular reason? Things like that. Then we move into pre-production. This is when we are scheduling interviews, all that lovely scheduling I was referring to earlier. We're contacting potential guests, seeing if they're interested in being interviewed, coordinating schedules to set up an interview with them. We're writing, copy editing, and revising interview questions. We send a version of interview questions to our guests ahead of time. Not everyone does, but for the types of questions that we're interested in, it makes more sense. There's also a kind of element of improv in the episodes themselves, but they do get some format of the interview questions. The guest sends us material that we use to create promotional materials. And then we move into production. So then we actually are recording the interview. We are also recording, that's me interviewing the guest. I also record the episode introduction, which includes, here is our guest, here's their bio, here's what we discussed in the episode and how it connects to the podcast theme. At this stage, we're also designing the episode promotional images. So these are the images that you see show up in Apple Podcasts. These are the images you see show up in all of our social media accounts, on our website, that our guests circulate to their friends and colleagues and family, things like that. Then we move into post-production, and that is audio editing. So currently I edit every episode of the podcast. We edit for length and sound quality, which can be trickier than you might think. There's a lot of technical stuff involved in that. I add the intro and the outro. So that's the show, this welcome to the show, the little jingle at the top of it, and then the little jingle at the end of it. Once the episode is edited and complete to distribution. So at that point, we're uploading the file itself, as well as the metadata, to Libsyn, our podcast host server. We're also writing show notes. Christopher Prasad, who is on the Ideas on Fire team, works on our show notes and writes some really fantastic show notes, if I do say so myself. I also work with him on some elements of that. We create and we schedule the social media posts to promote the episode, as well as the emails that promote the episode. And then finally, the episode gets released. But our work isn't done. The episode goes live on the day that it's been scheduled for release. It goes live on all the podcast players. It goes live on our website. Our scheduled social media posts and emails promote it over the next several months, and folks can actually listen to it and hopefully share. So that's our process, our kind of workflow process for each episode. And then the last slide on here, I'm not going to talk through. I'm just going to let you know it's here. So when you get the link to the slide deck, you'll know what this is. I put here a bunch of links to tools that you might use to start your podcast or to work on the podcast you're already working on. Again, I'm not going to read through this, but this covers everything from like hosting to storage to recording equipment, editing, software, all that kind of good stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and come back. Maybe. Come back. There we go. Okay. So let's see. What questions? Yeah, so Minha asked, can you provide a link to the podcasting host? And Heather jumped in. Thank you, Heather. Yes, that's the correct link to Libsyn. There's a bunch of other podcast hosts. SoundCloud, you might have heard of. There are a few other big ones, but Libsyn is probably the most well-known. And in my opinion, given the situation of podcast hosts right now, is my favorite, and I think offers the most for the widest array of people who are making podcasts. So whether you're a complete beginner, like this is your first podcast and you're just exploring this stuff, Libsyn is really fantastic for that. It doesn't presume that you're already an expert, which is super nice. But if you are pretty advanced in this, let's say you already have a podcast or two, it can do some really nifty advanced stuff as well. So I'm a big fan of Libsyn. Let's see, other questions. So Lacey wants to know, making money on a podcast might not be a thing, but how can it or does it help your brand? Can the experience be used as a value add for the academic or alternative academic market? Nice. So yes, you're not going to make any money on your podcast. I wish that were true, but it's true. There are some opportunities for monetization, sponsorships, things like that, advertising, but those only kick in once you have a very large audience. So and it takes a really long time to build a really large audience. So for all intents and purposes, you're not going to make any money on your podcast, which means you should do it for some other reason. But your question about how, if it can be used as a kind of skill, a useful skill on the academic job market or non-academic job market, I would say absolutely yes. Putting together podcasts teaches you all kinds of skills that are relevant in a variety of industries. It obviously, all of the sound stuff teaches you some pretty hardcore software skills, teaches you audio editing skills, teaches you things about sound manipulation. And you can do this to whatever degree you're comfortable. So you can get as fancy with the audio editing as you want, in which case you could do some really advanced sound design you could develop some pretty advanced sound design skills. On the other hand, if that's like not your thing or that sounds intimidating if you're just starting out, you also are developing, media production skills, right? And the way that media gets made, the way that it gets produced is not radically different across different industries. There are some specificity things about like how a film gets made is slightly different than how a television show gets made, which is slightly different than how radio gets made, which is slightly different than how podcasts get made. But in a really broad sense, they're very similar and there's a lot of overlap. So if you are intrigued by, I don't know, the film industry or something like that, or television, and you want to create a podcast can be, if you set it up right, can be a good way to learn some of the skills that you would use in those other industries. Absolutely. It also, depending on the genre, the kind of format that you've chosen, it also teaches you about interviewing, right? It teaches you about creating interview questions, which has and how to develop rapport with people with people on air. We don't do ours live, it's recorded, obviously. But it does teach you how to interview people, which is a pretty useful skill. Does that answer your question, Lacey? Okay. And Amon asks, how much time would you say it takes to come to grips with sound editing? That's a great question, for sure. Without an easy, straightforward answer, unfortunately. It really does depend. The format of the show that you pick will shape the amount of time and skill you need for audio editing. So for instance, if you start with a chat-based show where it's just you are the only voice on the entire episode, in general, there are some exceptions, but in general, that's not going to take as much audio editing time or skill because you can just re-record it. If you mess up, you can just re-record it because it's just you, right? You can write out the narrative script ahead of time. You can literally read it and know, you can even look down at your paper the entire time when you're reading it, unlike when you're giving a visual presentation, right? So in that sense, it would take less audio editing time and less time to build up those skills. Conversely, if you're doing something like a narrative show, that requires a huge amount of audio editing skills, and I would not recommend that for a beginner. You can start to build those for sure, but that will take time. Audio editing is one of the things that a lot of people farm out. There are a lot of fantastic audio editors who charge reasonable rates and produce really amazing work that will edit your podcast episodes for you. We don't do that. I learned how to do it myself, and so I do it all in-house. And it's not super hard. It's not super intimidating, but that does depend on the format that you've chosen. So if you're picking a format where you want lots of sounds layered on top of one another, that will take more time and that requires a larger degree of skill. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Aman? Cool. Yay. Okay. Who else? Oh, Aman also wants to know, could you tell us a little bit about whether it has helped you engage with ideas and audiences differently? Absolutely. Yes. Because like any genre, a good example, a good kind of comparison would be teaching, right? So those of you who are scholars and who also teach, right? You produce your own research, but you publish things, but you also teach. Think about how you approach the same text or the same concept differently in those two different contexts. So for example, how do you explain Judith Butler's concept of performativity to 19-year-olds in your intro to whatever class? Differently than you engage with Butler's concept of performativity in your scholarship, right? One isn't necessarily better than the other or truer than the other or smarter than the other even, but the way that you approach it, the language that you use to describe it, the number and type of examples that you provide is different, right? Because your audience is different. And as you do more publishing and as you do more teaching, you learn how to adapt to those different audiences. You learn that this audience needs this kind of example. That audience needs that kind of example. This audience needs this kind of terminology. This audience needs to go through this logic to get to the end, right? And podcasting is no different. So you learn the kinds of language, the kind of terminology, the jargon, or lack thereof, that works in an audio format in a way that's just different than a conference presentation or teaching or a journal article or any other kind of writing. So in that sense, yes, you can approach the same topic from different angles, which actually lets you see it differently. A lot of times this happens with teaching, right? You teach, say you're teaching a text that you engage with very heavily in your research, and you think that it's just a matter of, oh, just simplify it. But it's not actually about simplifying it for teaching, right? It's about approaching it from a completely different perspective. It's not less than, it's different than. If you approach it as just simplify it, just dumb this down, it's not effective teaching, right? Students, it doesn't work with students. They're pretty good barometers of this, right? You have to approach it differently. And so it forces you to engage with familiar material in a different way. And so in that sense, yeah, it's really cool. Are there other questions about podcasting? No? Okay. Yeah, go for it. So Aman asks, how do you get the feedback from your podcast audience? So there are a couple different ways, and it will depend on who your podcast audience actually is. So just just technically, in terms of kind of tools and software. A lot of the podcast hosting companies give you access to things like download numbers, give you access to metrics over time. They give you stats, so they give you numerical feedback. When, during what month did people download this episode? During what month did they not download this episode? Which episodes get the most downloads, right? And then you can interpret that, hopefully, accordingly. Does that mean that the topic in this episode is somehow more engaging to my audience, or does it just mean that it came out at a particularly apt moment, like when the public conversation was about that topic, and so this lent itself to that, right? And that's something that you do in the analysis, in the same way that you analyze any kind of stats if you deal with numbers in your scholarly research, right? Like, here are the numbers, what are they telling us? In terms of more qualitative feedback, so humans saying words as opposed to software recording numbers, that can happen in a couple different places. It can happen in comments on distribution platforms, so things like iTunes reviews or reviews on SoundClouds, or comments if you release it on YouTube or something like that. You can often get comments through that way. You also, depending on how you release it, so for instance, ours is posted on all of the podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and SoundCloud and all that kind of stuff. So we get some feedback through those platforms. It's also hosted on not hosted, but it's posted on our website, every episode, with extensive show notes, so people can engage with it through our website directly. We also send it out to our email list. So oftentimes people will hit reply to that email and say, I just listened to this episode. Here's what I think. Here's some questions I have. I think it's great, or whatever. So we often get it directly from them. And then through social media is a big way that you get feedback. And it's direct, which is really nice. It tends to be, it happens faster, which is nice, much faster than, say, like peer review, which takes forever. So it takes you like months or even years to figure out what people think of your thing. In contrast to this, someone tweets back at us like, hey, I just listened to this episode. I think it's awesome. Or I just listened to this episode with this person. I had this question about something they said. So it is kind of an immediate type of feedback, which is super nice. Yeah, but it's a combination of both quantitative and qualitative. We tend to put more emphasis on the qualitative. Our topic is fairly niche. Our audience is pretty niche, and we're happy with that. So download numbers are not something we're chasing. Other people who have more, who have different types of shows, download numbers and kind of mass distribution is something that they pay more attention to than the kind of qualitative stuff. So it depends on what your goals are for the show itself. And Joey Orr asks, is there somewhere online that they can watch this, they can watch the replay? Yeah, so once we finish up the live broadcast here right now, which we're gonna wrap up in a couple minutes, give it about 5 minutes, and at this same URL, if you just hang out here, the video will be uploaded, so you can just watch the recording here. In about an hour, those of you who are registered, you'll also get an email with a link to the replay video, which is right here, as well as a link to the slide deck. Are there other questions about anything I've talked about or anything I didn't get to talk about with regards to podcasting? Okay, doesn't look like there are. Thank you so much for hanging out and being interested in podcasts. I could talk about this stuff all day. It's super duper fun. I would encourage, if you're curious about podcasting, tinker around with it. It's very much one of those things that you can play around with. You don't have to go from 0 to national show in 6.5 seconds kind of deal. You can tinker around with it. Make an episode of something. It doesn't even have to connect to anything. You don't have to have a bigger goal, but just kind of play around with it. See what recording software your computer comes with, because it comes with it. See what audio editing software your computer already comes with. It comes installed on most PCs and Macs. Tinker around with themes. think about who you might want to interview if you like the idea of interviewing, and play around with it. It doesn't have to be permanent. You don't even have to release it if you don't want to. You don't even have to put it up on a host somewhere until you're ready. But play around with it. It's an enormously exciting and energetic medium that has a huge amount of energy behind it right now, and it's just gonna get bigger. And you're at a kind of cool moment when it's not super huge yet, so it's easy to get in on, but it's going to be it's growing exponentially. And so there's a lot of really cool people who are producing podcasts, who are teaching about podcasts, who are supporting each other in making podcasts. So I would encourage you to try it out if it's something you're intrigued by. Okay, thank you very much. Our next webinar is coming up on October 24th, and that is a webinar, a Grad School Rockstars webinar. For those of you who are in grad school or know grad students, you might want to tell them about that. And we're going to be talking about building your professional community, particularly in graduate school. And then the one after that, coming up November 14th, is focused on turning your dissertation into a book. So those of you who are thinking about writing your first book or revising your dissertation into a first book, I highly recommend that one. As I said, it's coming up November 14th. You can find out information about all of our upcoming events and other programs at ideasonfire.net/events. Thanks so much for being here, and hopefully I'll see you at our next one. Bye.